What is this stuff?
Yeah, Mr. Spooky. That's a joke. Seriously.
Back in the 1970s, the station wagon was dominant in nearly every American family's garage. But by the mid-80s, along came the minivan, followed by the SUV, and then crossovers. The latter just a different name for wagons with taller roofs. Known as estates, or shooting brake in Europe, they continue to be popular there. But by the 1990s in the US, the wagon market was in significant decline. And by the 2000s, it was clear they would never again be the dominant people mover they once were. Here are my top 10 picks for station wagon sales flops from the 1990s to today, listed in order they first went up for sale in the US. This is my old car. Number 10, 1991 Geo Storm Wagonback. This car I think is the best-worst example of how wagon models shrunk during the 1980s in an effort to maximize cargo space in compact cars. It was popular in cars like the Ford Escort, GM's compact J-body line, and of course Japanese models like the Toyota Corolla and Honda Civic, which successfully modified their hatchbacks to become wagons. However, it was another Japanese car company, Isuzu, that had far less success with their Impulse hatchback. General Motors imported a variation of the Impulse to the US and sold it under the then new Geo brand.
I'd love to drive a car for under 11 grand, man. That would be hot.
It was called the Geo Storm, and when it first arrived in the US in 1990, it was small, sporty, and was well liked by younger drivers, but generally considered odd by older drivers.
See your Chevrolet Geo dealer and get to know Geo Storm.
The shape of the rear window made for a small cargo area, so Isuzu came up with a new body style option in 1991 that was marketed by Geo as the Storm hatchback. However, most owners refer to this new body style as the Wagonback, since the first Geo Storm was technically a hatchback as well, although Geo called that one a coupe. The Wagonback's squared off rear roofline maxed out the cargo space, but if older drivers thought the first Storm looked weird, the new Wagonback turned away younger drivers as well. It didn't help when in 1992, the Storm lost one of its sporty looking features, its partially hidden headlamps, replaced with just smaller fixed headlamps. Low sales forced Geo to drop the Wagonback after the end of the 1992 model year, and thanks to the Impulse being a complete flop in sales, Isuzu halted its production, which in turn relegated the original coupe version of the Storm to history before the end of 1993. Number 9, 1991 Oldsmobile Custom Cruiser. This is one of two wagons on this list which were only available as a wagon. There was no sedan or any other body style that shared the Custom Cruiser name. This name had been in use by Oldsmobile as far back as 1940, but wasn't used for full-size wagons until GM redesigned their full-size B-body platform in 1971. Nearly identical to its platform mates from Chevrolet and Buick, the Custom Cruiser was looking seriously dated by the time the second-generation B-body, which started back in 1977, had reached its end in 1990.
They you at the drive-thru, okay?
In their place in 1991 was the same body-on-frame rear-drive design underneath, but with a new bulbous exterior that shocked most of the older clientele that still wanted to own a wagon. The Custom Cruiser was still a near copy of the Chevrolet Caprice and Buick Roadmaster. However, it was the only model of the three that did not offer the fake wood sides, a feature that all of the previous B-body wagons had offered since 1971. The Cruiser also offered far less chrome than the Chevy or Buick, possibly an attempt by Oldsmobile to cater to a potentially younger audience, which simply wasn't going to happen with a full-size wagon. In their first two model years, the Caprice sold over 18,000 wagons, and the Roadmasters sold over 17,000 wagons. Not great numbers, but far better than Olds, which sold less than 12,000 wagons in its first 2 years, with a nearly 50% drop from 1991 to 92, leading to its cancellation. The Chevy and Buick would end their wagons and the entire B-body platform 4 years later, and GM never tried selling a full-size wagon in the US again, although they tried again with smaller wagons later in this list. Number 8, 1993 Mitsubishi Diamante Wagon. When Honda's new luxury division Acura was launched in 1986, it introduced its first luxury sedan, the Legend. It took much smaller Japanese automaker Mitsubishi off guard, not expecting that any Japanese rival would try to compete in the US luxury car market. To stay competitive, they stretched their existing Galant platform to become the Diamante, which was originally intended only for export, due to the high taxes the Japanese government placed on large cars. But when the size restrictions were lifted in 1989, the Diamante was a sales hit in Japan in 1990, which led to plans for export to the US in 1991 for the 1992 model year.
First medium class, Diamante, 新登場.
A wagon version was also produced for 1993, but was built only in Australia for sale there, and also export to the US, where Mitsubishi hoped it would have an advantage over Acura, and now also Lexus and Infiniti, to offer a luxury wagon. The closest option was the Toyota Camry wagon, which almost made this list as well. Although BMW and Mercedes also sold wagons in the US, they sold at a lower rate than the sedans, as sedans were their most popular body style back then. Mitsubishi didn't have great brand recognition anyway, and what it did have was for either economy or sports cars, so the Diamante already had a disadvantage with Mitsubishi not being considered a luxury brand. The wagon imports to the US ended in 1995, and sedan imports a year after that, selling only to fleets in 1996. Surprisingly, Mitsubishi offered a second generation of the Diamante in 1997, but only the sedan was exported to the US until it finally died in 2004. Number 7. 2000 Saturn LW. When the Saturn brand was first launched by General Motors in 1990, their all-plastic bodies and no haggle pricing was a big hit. The first and only models at its start were the S Series, S meaning small, and were offered as coupes, sedans, and wagons. As those sales slipped when the new millennium approached, Saturn's first expansion into a second model was, not unexpectedly, the L Series, with L meaning large, and wagon versions were offered, the LW1 and LW2. The L Series was built in Delaware, as opposed to Saturn's first plant in Spring Hill, Tennessee, and weren't an all-new design like the S Series was. Instead, they were based on an existing model, the Vectra, provided by GM's then European subsidiary Opel.
The new LS, born in Germany, built here.
The L Series wagons would be GM's only mid-size wagon offering during that time, which admittedly was becoming less relevant as an advantage. Although sales for the first year were respectable, Saturn was forced to do a name change for the 2001 model year, as the LS, LS1, and LS2 sedan models were changed to L100, L200, and L300, thanks to Lexus forcing the change to avoid confusion with their flagship LS400 sedan.
No f***ing way.
Although the wagon's name of LW didn't have to change, Saturn still renamed them to LW200 and LW300 to be consistent. Despite a refresh in 2003, sales continued to slide, so much so for the wagon that in 2004, the two wagon trims were combined into one and renamed yet again, this time to be the L300 station wagon, dropping the W, and effectively sharing the sedan's L300 name. A third name change didn't help the wagon, as Saturn killed it in 2004, and the remaining sedans were dead the following year.
The fuck? That's a Saturn?
Saturn would never offer another wagon, instead focusing on, no surprise here, an SUV model instead.
That's a Saturn?
Yeah.
Number 6. 2002 Lexus IS300 SportCross. Having been quite successful as Toyota's US luxury division for nearly a decade, the introduction of the IS series in 1998, the first performance-themed car for Lexus, came as a bit of a surprise to the typical Lexus owner, not to mention its small size that put it in the compact car category, despite being based on a shortened mid-size platform. The small size and focus on performance was intended to bring in more youthful buyers to a brand that, like its parent company Toyota, skewed much older, but its small size also meant less practicality, something that Lexus still wanted to offer.
You know, Lexus, the luxury division of Toyota, possibly the cockiest car company in the world.
Starting in 2002, Lexus extended the roofline of the IS300 and replaced the trunk with a rear hatch, thereby creating what they called the SportCross, yet another example of avoiding the use of the word wagon, as the word crossover was just starting to reach the automotive world. But considering the SportCross was the same height as the IS300 sedan, it really was a wagon, and considering the IS was supposed to be a sport-themed model, its wagon proportions weren't a big hit in the US. Surprisingly, Lexus managed to keep the SportCross in its lineup for 3 years, up until the end of the IS's first generation, despite less than 3,000 being sold in the US. So it was no surprise that when the second gen began in 2005, the SportCross was gone, and Lexus has never tried to sell a wagon in the US since.
This was the first, last, and only station wagon that Lexus has ever offered.
Before we continue with this list, here are some trivia questions for you. Do you know why station wagons are called station wagons? The wagon portion of the name originates from the primary way we moved people and cargo for centuries, before the automobile was invented. Although they were typically called horse-drawn carriages, which, by the way, the word carriage is the origin of the word car. Carriages were also called wagons, and when the only other mode of transportation was the train, passengers often had large amounts of luggage on those trains, and the wagons helped carry those passengers and their luggage from the train station to their home, hence the name station wagon.
Wagons! East!
In Europe, they are called estates for a similar reason, except in the opposite direction. These vehicles carry passengers and their cargo from the train station to their estate. Less commonly used, except among car people, is the term shooting brake, which also originates with horse-drawn carriages. The word brake refers to breaking in young horses to pull the carriages, although it is typically spelled as B-R-A-K-E when referring to a car. The word shooting in the name came from a common use for these horse-drawn carriages, carrying men's gear while on shooting parties, itself a British term for bird hunting. Now back to the list.
Oh, where the spare wheel was?
Yeah.
Where's that now?
Oh, it's gone.
Number 5. 2005 Dodge Magnum. Considering the sales number for this wagon are a lot higher than most others on this list, I'm sure some of you watching this will question why I included it as a sales flop. And in case your head is stuck in the 70s, you may question this to be a wagon at all. That's because this is one of many examples where automakers reuse model names on entirely different cars, as the first Dodge Magnum was one of the last models to use Chrysler's rear-wheel drive body-on-frame B platform. It was intended to supplement the Dodge Charger to provide a more aerodynamic option for NASCAR.
See the new Dodge Magnum XE, a magic means of transportation.
This first Magnum only lasted 2 years, but its association with the Charger would return 25 years later. But this time the Magnum would only be sold as a wagon, with no sedan counterpart, only the second car on this list to carry that distinction. Following the end of Chrysler's successful LH platform in 2004, their merger with Daimler-Benz allowed access to Mercedes design and engineering, and a big risk to going back to rear-wheel drive and bringing back V8 power. Even more surprising was the first car Dodge would offer with this new platform was the 2005 Dodge Magnum, which although offered budget-minded V6 engines, optional was the SRT 8 trim that debuted for the 2006 model year with a 6.1-liter Hemi V8. Upon its debut, with no Dodge sedan to choose instead, over 90,000 Magnums were sold by the end of 2005. However, once the new Dodge Charger, a four-door sedan with the same engine options, went on sale for the 2006 model year, Dodge buyers had a choice, and for many, it wasn't going to be a wagon. Sales of the Magnum dropped each year over the next few years, with less than 7,000 sold in 2008, despite Dodge actually making the effort to do an exterior and interior refresh that only lasted that last year, making this last model year a rare find. Despite the economic crash of 2008, Dodge still managed to sell over 100,000 Chargers that same year, so it was no surprise when the Magnum didn't make the cut to keep the company afloat.
Dude, what do you got in that thing?
I got an amp, guitar, surfboard, ladder, and 12 2x4s.
Number 4. 2005 Jaguar X-Type Sportwagon. When the X-Type was introduced in 2001 for the 2002 model year, Jaguar as a brand was being completely retooled by its new owner Ford, who intended to move Jaguar away from a niche market automaker to a serious competitor in the luxury car market. Ironically, the way they did that was to introduce what would be Jaguar's most inexpensive model to date, the X-Type, which shared much of its underlying design with the Mondeo, Ford's high-volume, far-from-luxury model sold in Europe, as well as the US spec Ford Contour.
Genetically, you are 98% identical to a halibut, but it's the 2% that makes the difference.
Although Jaguar purists denounced it as not being a true Jaguar, the X-Type would rack up sales worldwide so high in 2002 that it outsold every other Jaguar model combined. This led parent Ford to consider something else new for Jaguar, their first wagon, or should I say estate, as this would be more appropriate for this once entirely British, although now American-owned automaker. However, when brought to the US for its first model year in 2005, it wasn't called an estate. They named it the Sportwagon. No surprise considering Americans wouldn't understand the estate name. Most every automaker has tacked on the word sport to models which don't fully live up to the name, and this was another example of that. The X-Type wasn't a true sports car to begin with, so updating its shape to be a more utilitarian wagon didn't help, especially since it made the car weigh more with the same V6 it had before. The Sportwagon managed to stay in the Jaguar lineup for 4 model years, a remarkable feat when you consider only 1,600 total were sold here over the entirety of those 4 years. Despite their rarity, the fact that it was based on the cheapest Jaguar ever sold makes them more of a unicorn than valuable today.
This is the best ski lift I've ever been on.
Number 3. 2010 Saab 93X. This one was heavily based on the 9.3 wagon, essentially a long-roof 9.3 sedan. By the time GM's ownership of Saab had reached the mid-2000s, there was little of Saab's likeness or engineering left, as every model shared a platform with other GM models. But the first 9.3 came out in 1998, and although it was a GM platform, it still maintained most of the brand's Swedish Saab quirks, although no wagon offering. That changed in 2003 with the addition of the Sport Combi model, an attempt by GM to bring the Swedish practicality and tradition of a wagon back to the brand. Although of course not calling it a wagon for US sales. But the call of the SUV couldn't be stopped, and Saab continued to rework GM and even partner Subaru models into American-loving crossovers. By 2010, despite Saab's bleak future outlook, they released the 93X, which was essentially a sport combi riding 1.4 inches higher on bigger wheels, rugged-looking body cladding with a roof rack, and something they called cross-wheel drive, essentially an all-wheel drive system that was supposed to work well both on and off-road. But with virtually no Saab loyalists remaining to buy their product, the 93X suffered the same fate as all other Saab 9X models. Saab managed to sell less than 500 units of the 93X before it died, along with the entire brand, in 2012. Number 2. 2010 Cadillac CTS Wagon. The decision to make this model is an extension of the significant risks Cadillac took nearly 10 years earlier to completely remake its once stodgy lineup. After the failure that was the Opel-based Catera, Cadillac released the CTS in 2002, along with the now classic appearance in the first sequel of the Matrix franchise, to completely turn the Cadillac brand and image on its head. Gone were the curvy but uninspired lines of the Catera, replaced by hard angles and a more sporty character with the CTS. By the time the CTS entered its second generation in 2008, the CTS led the way with a completely revamped lineup for Cadillac. With continued decent sales even during GM's bankruptcy in 2009, GM took a chance on adding a wagon option to the CTS line in late 2009 for the 2010 model year, making it the first, and so far the only production wagon for Cadillac. The roofline of the CTS wagon was sloped back to maintain the same lines of the sedan, and the tail lamps were stretched up to the top of the D-pillars, a dramatic look that made the wagon look far different in the rear than the sedan. In 2011, Cadillac made the even more bonkers decision to include the wagon in their V-Series high-performance lineup. Although the second-gen CTS would be a success in sales, with 254,000 sold during that generation's 6-year run, only around 7,000 of those were wagons. Among those 7,000 were only 1,200 CTS Vs, making them the rarest of any V-Series model up to that point. Today, a V-Series CTS wagon is very likely to sell for more than it did when it was new, a rare feat for any station wagon, especially one sold in the US. Number 1. 2018 Buick Regal TourX. If there was ever a division of General Motors that would take a chance at bringing back an automotive body style that was effectively dead in the US, it would be Buick. Despite its ongoing effort to lower its average buyer age, they still have a history of catering to older clientele, and in 2018, it didn't want to completely eliminate them as potential customers. Or maybe they thought this was their chance to make the wagon cool again. Either way, the addition of a new wagon option for the Buick Regal, called the TourX, was unexpected, especially considering that GM had no other wagons for sale in the US market. It also was the first time in 35 years that the Regal was offered with a wagon option. This change was done at the same time Buick also reworked the Regal sedan to have a liftback, calling it the Sportback, which, like the wagon, made it more practical than the small four-door sedan the Regal had been previously. Both the Regal TourX and Sportback were essentially rebadges of the Opel Insignia that was sold in Europe, a relatively inexpensive decision as compared to a new design of the previous generation Regal sedan. The TourX, when sold in the US, had additional body cladding added around the wheels, the sole purpose of which was to make American buyers think it was a low-roof SUV, even though it wasn't built for any serious off-road use.
I guess it kind of makes it look a little roughy-tufty. Like it wants to throw down a little. No, not really. It's just weird.
It was only offered with a turbocharged 2-liter 4-cylinder, so no chance of it being a suitable replacement for the CTS V wagon. Despite the Regal racking up sales over 100,000 a year in China, the best year of this generation Regal in the US barely topped 14,000 in 2018, with less than half going to the TourX. By 2020, after less than 2,500 sold, production was halted thanks to General Motors selling its Opel division to PSA. However, the low sales likely wouldn't have justified it surviving much longer anyway. Buick is now a crossover-only brand here in the US, and I'm willing to bet this will be the last wagon model GM will ever sell in the US as well. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 70s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.
Yeah.